people talk about the banality of evil. I think Hannah Arendt coined that phrase. I think, there are certain things that I think need to be addressed, and one is the feeling that, well, I can't do anything. I'm just one little voice. I'm too powerless. Therefore, I won't do anything. I think a lot of people are kept at that level of apathy due to lack of self-esteem, lack of self-worth, self-empowerment. I think the education system has a lot to blame for here. The incredibly top-centred, examination-pressured kind of box target-driven examination system that makes people feel inadequate intellectually. Rather than starting with people's natural instincts and sense of wonder and love of nature and love of art and so on and so on, it crams stuff into their heads that nobody's very good at, sort of algebra and trigonometry, and things that make them feel they're no good, right? So you go to school to be taught you're ignorant, basically, which performs the sociological functioning of keeping the population acquiescent, so that then they'll come out of school and go and fill the factory jobs or whatever's needed. I think the dumbing down starts in education.
Do you think it's conscious and intentional?
That's a big question, and it kind of goes into all kinds of philosophical issues. I think it's mostly unconscious. I think I'm enough of a Freudian and a Jungian to see the dynamics of the unconscious at work. I'm also enough of an elitist to believe that the real elites actually want the empowerment of everyone. Paradoxically, I've met some incredibly influential and powerful people on this planet who are extremely good people. Have a lot of time for monarchs, for instance, okay? What I have a problem with is the middle management types. The people, the bureaucrats, okay? The monarch types and princes are often visionaries. I like them. It's the bureaucrats who kind of implement policies and churn out endless ticker tapes of rules and regs that I think are blocking the vision that both the kind of the dispossessed and the elites actually share in common. So I think the real question we should be asking is why did we invent bureaucracy? Why did we invent this kind of... The minute somebody comes up with a creative idea in our society, they immediately get 100,000 bureaucrats telling them why it can't be done and why it won't work. Rather than...
Why is that?
Well, that's the question as a philosopher I've kind of asked, And I'm fascinated by the sociology of knowledge. Karl Mannheim, great sociologist, active in the 40s, invented this field of sociology called the sociology of knowledge, which is how ideas translate or not into realities through social behaviour. And that's all to do with in-group, out-group, competition for who has the best ideas and so on. I've noticed over the centuries, if you have good ideas and you really want to do something with them, you basically have to keep quiet and just get on with it. Because there is a lot of, psychological unfinished business. Death by committee is what we're suffering from as a planet. If this planet blows up, it'll be because of committees making the wrong decisions. And usually it's because people are afraid to speak out in those committees, because they will be ostracised. Even in the cabinet, we've seen this recently with allegations of bullying by the Prime Minister and his entourage. I think it's true. There is a climate of bullying, and what goes on here is people usurping power, misusing their influence, and actually the one thing that those kind of bureaucrat types can't say is, I don't know. They can't admit to ignorance. They can't admit to doubt. Everybody's certain about what they profess, and everybody is sure they've got the way. That's very dangerous. As a philosopher, I advocate the policy of doubt, of uncertainty, of stopping, pausing, rewinding and questioning, analysing. That's the job of the philosopher. That's the Socratic tradition. Socrates dared to get up in Athens and say, I don't know. Do you? We need more of that. But bureaucracies don't like that because they deal with certainties, they deal with policies, they deal with targets, they deal with quotas and so I think that's part of the problem. But I think we will get there. I feel and things like the new media, things like the internet, things like visionary people like yourself, individuals who are prepared to do it, who are prepared to make the effort to think up a different way, to change the conversation. If enough of us come together, we can shift the whole conversation to another key. I think it'll take a kind of quantum leap. If enough people actually start talking the truth to each other, even on a micro scale, it ripples out. And the truth is really just asking the questions, and framing those questions in a creative and constructive way.
I was talking to a Chinese girl. I was telling her about my Facebook. And she said, "Oh, we can't have Facebook in China." And so I said, "Well, what do you think about that?" Expecting her to say, "Oh, yes, it's not good." But she didn't. She said, "Yeah, well, we trust the government to do what's best for us." And I thought about that, and I thought about and how she seemed quite happy. In fact, all the Chinese people I've met seem quite happy. And she's been here for 3 years, so she's not like she hasn't been exposed to the West. And then I thought about everybody here who hates the government, doesn't trust the government, and is desperately unhappy on a daily basis. I'm thinking, well, I don't have a conclusion to that, other than that really stimulated a questioning in me about almost habitual knee-jerk mistrust and hating of politicians and management, what I would call managers of the culture, and then the dissatisfaction within that most people seem to have in the West, with a few exceptions, and the East, where they accept the government and they accept being told what they can do and what they can't do, and what they can read and what they can't read, and are quite happy with that.
Gosh, there's a lot there. I mean, is it true that you can't have Facebook in China? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Is that a fact?
So,
right.
yeah.
Okay.
A lot of things they can't have.
Yeah, I mean, Google is now, you can't have Google in there.
They don't want you thinking outside the box, basically. And yet, dissidence is healthy, as we said earlier, when on the tape that didn't record. The society should actually embrace dissidence because it helps society grow.
I don't believe in just dissidence for the sake of dissidence. I don't believe in like a perpetual oppositional position. There's a paradox between, if you want, conservatism, which affirms a culture's roots and heritage and so on, and revolutionaryism, which kind of seeks to totally overthrow a system. I've studied and taught political philosophy as well, so I'm very interested in these matters. On the specific issue of China and dissent and freedom of thought and so on, I have some particular views on that. I have a lot of interest and knowledge of Chinese philosophy. I've taught Confucianism and Taoism for many years. I've studied the Chinese classics. I have a huge respect for the traditional Chinese philosophical heritage. What happened with the communist revolution in China was quite a major systemic change to China's civilization, and there's a very important text which I recommend students to read called The Black Book of Communism, published by a group of academics and historians back in the 90s in France. It was translated into English. Now it's 1,000 pages long, and it documents the abuses and systemic genocides conducted by communist regimes around the planet during the course of the 20th century. In Cambodia, for instance, the killing fields, but also in other places, the Soviet Gulag, and also in China. And there's like a 30-40 page chapter on each of these places. Now, it documents the excesses in the late 40s, early 50s, and during the 60s in China, when it was at its heyday. During the Cultural Revolution of China, so-called, teachers, philosophers, intellectuals, such as myself, if they were suspected of reactionary thought, were arrested by their students and paraded up and down the playgrounds and the lecture halls and stuff with placards saying, "I'm a reactionary pig dog." And they were literally tortured to death. They literally had their eyeballs plucked out.
How would you define reactionary?
Well, it's how they defined, reactionary pig dogs. It was basically anybody who didn't toe the then Maoist, revolutionary, communist line. So anyone that quoted Lao Tzu or Christ or Buddha, and it was suspected immediately of idealism, right? And they were immediately, like, the placards went on. Anyone that appealed to spirit beyond the material plane was regarded automatically as a reactionary. Now, if that's true, I'm an extreme reactionary, because I do believe in spirit. And I believe in it because it's the safeguard of ethics. As a philosopher, if you remove all spirit from existence, if you remove all transpersonal or spiritual or religious conversations from polite society, and you refer everything back to our material needs and their immediate satisfaction, you've taken away the source of any possible ethics. As a philosopher, all ethical systems are rooted in some kind of metaphysical judgment, post-mortem. Kant's only argument for the existence of God was based on the argument from ethics. There has to be some kind of underpinning of the difference between right and wrong, good and evil. Take the case in Britain of the Bulger killers, the little 10-year-olds who killed a little boy. There seems to be no sense of ethics in those kids. Now, unfortunately, we're breeding up a generation of kids that's true. It's amoral. Because they're fed a kind of materialist line that the only thing that matters in life is need satisfaction, football, and kicks, highs. Now, if there's no sense of duty or responsibility, you end up with atrocities ultimately down the line. Now, what China then went on and did to the Tibetan people was an extension of this. In a sense, Tibet is the kind of metaphysical conscience of China. And the monks and nuns who were tortured during this cultural revolution, and the monasteries were often destroyed, is a great tragedy. Now, the fact that most Chinese people don't know it happened, or resist knowing it happened, is itself part of the way that news is managed and controlled. I think we ought to be asking very uncomfortable questions about Tibet. The fact that China has a nuclear weapons program which depends on the use of the Tibetan plateau for testing and for the uranium is something that Greenpeace have discovered, but it's not general common knowledge. There's something else about China that I find very interesting which should be asked. When Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan with the Taliban back in the late 90s, apparently, according to a very interesting book on the history of Mossad, which I've read, he flew 3 times to Beijing to buy weapons from the Chinese government. And the Chinese government was the main weapons supplier to the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And Osama bin Laden was the middleman, right? Now, I've got an awkward question for the Chinese government, which is that true? Did you have Osama bin Laden in Beijing, and did you give him X billion dollars of weapons? Apparently, when the American-British forces got into the Tora Bora caves in Afghanistan, bin Laden had just kind of left, like the Mary Celeste. The place was full of Chinese weapons, right? So I've got some very interesting questions for the Chinese government. Why were you selling bin Laden weapons? Another question that follows on from that is, if you were that close and friendly with bin Laden, did they know about 9/11 before it happened? Was China somehow connected with this lead up to 9/11? And is bin Laden actually in China now? That's the question I've got. These are some of the awkward questions that, as a philosopher of peace, I feel need to be asked. There's a lot of conspiracy stuff about what happened around 9/11, but some of the key questions haven't been asked. I actually emailed the Chilcot inquiry, and I've shared some of these concerns and issues, which need asking. I don't think we're going to get peace on this planet until the big players level with each other and actually come clean about what they've done. The problem, of course, is that the villains are actually running the show and control the media and the banking system and the economic system, which makes it difficult.
it kind of runs through
Discuss.
society. You remember, especially in our generation, the whole thing of, oh, it fell off the back of a lorry, wink, wink. You know what I mean?
Right.
There's no difference from that. And the same mentality that thinks it's okay to rip us all off by charging too much for the oil for heating that we need in the winter.
You're saying it's a streak in human nature.
In human nature,
and it goes deep
and it
down.
just manifests on that fell off the back of a lorry, and it manifests on the bigger level of Lehman Brothers, and you know what I mean. But it's the same thing.
Okay, so where does that take us? I mean, Christianity talks about original sin. Every culture has something similar. There's something in human beings that is competitive, is violent, tends towards, dishonesty, blah blah blah. Yeah, there is that. There's the bad news.
Yeah.
I mean,
Is that
there's a default to violence, but I think there is also a default to light. There is a place in us which is heroic, which is visionary. I mean, take Schindler, Oskar Schindler, right? He was a wheeler dealer. He was set up factories. He used Jewish labour, blah blah blah. He was a member of the Nazi Party, right? He could have just gone along with the system, but there was something in him which kicked in, which dissented, and he used his status to then help his workers, and as we know, he saved several thousand of them. I mean, I have a personal family link to Schindler. That's kind of why I'm interested in the case. I was born in Montreal. My parents lived there in the 50s, and they were friends with a lot of, let's say, liberal, peace activists, and a lot of the Jewish community of Montreal. People like Leonard Cohen, who was a young poet then, and Miriam Waddington, who was a Canadian poetess, was part of their circle. And there was a guy called Herb Steinhaus, who was a psychiatrist, who was, I think, one of my parents' closest friends. I vaguely remember as a child, these people coming into the house in Westmount. And Herb had been in the Canadian Army in World War II as a journalist attached to the Canadian Army. They'd liberated concentration camps. They fought their way to Berlin, whatever. And after the war, he stayed in UNESCO, helping set it up with the Canadian delegation in Paris. And he was in his office sometime in the late 40s, I don't know exactly when phone came up, there was somebody downstairs to see him. And this guy came up to his office in Paris, and it was a guy called Oskar Schindler, with a suitcase full of photographs and memorabilia and his life story. And he told Herb, this is what I've done, what I did. And nobody was interested. Herb said, this is amazing, you're incredible, have a seat, have a coffee, I will publicise your story. He tried to sell the story to the newspapers of Europe, and not a single one was interested in the story. They wouldn't publish it. They were into the bad news, not the good news. It was the advent of the Cold War, so they were publishing stories about how the other side were the devil. And they weren't interested in this. It was only years later when Spielberg made the movie, Schindler's List, that he tracked down Herb and came to see him in Montreal and looked at all the archives and the photos that Schindler had given him. And that's, I think, part of the problem here. We're too prone as people to focus on the negative, to look at the bad news. I actually don't believe there is more bad news than good. I think there are random acts of kindness going on all the time. I think there's heroic goodness going on this planet right now as I'm speaking. But there's that goodness within each of us.
Yeah, that's right. You said you felt like there's good, and my feeling is that there's a lot more goodness happening than there is bad. It's just that there is life and death.
But death isn't bad.
No.
I mean, death in a good
people
time.
Get trodden on, hurricanes happen.
Yeah, it's part of the life cycle.
Cars crash.
We have to be mature enough to accept it. I can die at any time, and that's
Why
fine.
do you think we focus on the bad rather than the good?
I think it's to do with ignorance, which, if you look at the etymology of the word, means ignorance, which is not knowing. And I think we ignore things that we don't quite understand. So if you're in a room and somebody comes in that's slightly different, you will ignore them. And that's the root of ignorance. Now, why do we ignore the good?
Could it be...
complex.
I'll just throw this out. Could it be that we're all afraid of death and pain, and therefore it touches a nerve with us, and we have this obsession because it feeds right into our fear and gives us somewhere to play out our fear? feel okay because it's not us.
That's an interesting theory, yeah. It's like an externalization of the pain that we ourselves don't want to feel, so we like to see it out there. Yeah. I think that's part of the answer. I mean, I've actually come up with another analysis of this, and I've coined a word called Sophiophobia, which means the fear of wisdom. Sophiophobia, it's something I've written about for a conference on humiliation studies in Berlin a few years ago with a colleague of mine, Dr. Evelyn Lindner. Now, Evelyn wrote a thesis for the University of Oslo on the psychology of humiliation, why it is that people humiliate each other to the point of death, torture, you know. And that work is very important and profound stuff, and it made me think why it is we often humiliate people that are wiser or cleverer than us. There's something in human nature that kind of wants to bring people down. I see this as a teacher all the time. If somebody is really clever and good at their work, the other kids gang up on them, and they mock them, and they tease them, and they bully them, and they say, you're so, you know, you want to be a clever. And there's that kind of nastiness in people. And I've seen that in my study of the lives of saints of all different religions. That's why, you know, people like Christ get martyred, because people are jealous of them. You know, what do you mean rabbis doing this, that, and the other, healing people? You know, bring them down. And that happens all over the place. Now, why? I think it explains partly why people were so jealous of the Jews in Europe, because they were clever, they were committed, they were spiritually profound people. Ordinary, you know, Europeans were jealous, they were suspicious. Why were these people like so clever, you know? Well, gas them, it's the answer. So my way of trying to understand this is what I call Sophiophobia, which is the fear of wisdom. I think we humans, we exist as amphibious creatures midway between the material world and the spiritual worlds. And we uncomfortably go back and forth like chameleons. And I think wisdom carries the burden of responsibility. If we know something, we then have to act with that knowledge. So one of the reasons for being afraid of too much wisdom is it brings a responsibility to act. If I don't know something, I can't be blamed. And I think this is a bureaucratic mentality. It's like, don't tell me that. I don't want to know that, you know. Otherwise I might have to do something about it. So that's one cause of Sophiophobia. I think it's reflected in the scriptures, in the story of Adam and Eve in the garden. If you get the apple of knowledge, it brings the fall. It brings the descent into matter, the descent into rivalry, conflict, you know, ordinary life. And therefore we choose not to accept knowledge as a culture. And I think this is why, I mean, the mob have always attacked the homes of the intellectuals. You know, John Dee, who was the astrologer-magician to Queen Elizabeth I in the Renaissance court of England, had his library burned by an angry mob who suspected him of black magic, just because he was a scientist and a philosopher. Okay, he was summoning angels, but, you know, he was one of the founders of spiritual research and stuff. Didn't like it. Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, likewise had his house burned by a mob because they were jealous of you know, of his work as a thinker. And that question of Sophiophobia, I think, is very interesting. You get it also in the legend of Taliesin, the Bard of Britain, who has 3 drops of the liquor of omniscience that fall onto his fingers. He licks them and becomes omniscient. And he has to flee from Ceridwen, who's the kind of angry goddess who comes after him. So those images of knowledge. Whereas what I'm saying is we have to go beyond Sophiophobia. We have to embrace wisdom as a culture and as a planet. We have to elect people of wisdom to high office. We have to search with searching questions of people that, you know, seek power and responsibility, and ensure that they're not Sophiophobia. One other very controversial issue, right, which is the whole war on drugs, okay, which is a very interesting topic. As a philosopher, I'm interested in. You know, the establishment clamps down on the use of drugs worldwide. It makes a huge big fuss about it, and it persecutes it. And, you know, man's been using drugs ever since the Stone Age. Hallucinogens, you know, magic mushrooms and so on. It's part of our coming of age as human beings. The shamans knew how to use it, what the right dose was. it was found to be an avenue into the alternate states of consciousness that brought wisdom. Terence McKenna even argues it led to speech and the advent of consciousness, you know. So it's a metaphysical right to explore those realms, right? Now, and therefore knowledge, in a sense, became symbolized by that, the imbibing of the right, ecstatic substance, if you want. Now, the problem with the establishment's war on drugs is it's actually effectively a war on consciousness. It's a war on primal consciousness. And in my work with the Stonehenge community and the Druid community and their rights to celebrate at Stonehenge and so on, it's made me think a great deal about the politics of consciousness, if you want, in today's society. And one of the things I would say is that the use of drugs should be made licensed, just as the way alcohol is and tobacco is. That way the state gets taxes from its use. California's moving in this direction. They've gone bust as a state. So many people use marijuana, it's just a joke. A lot of them on medical grounds, which they've legalized. The next step is to realize that actually it doesn't make sense to have a war on drugs. Let's have a peace on drugs. Allow those people that want to use these things for their own mystical and metaphysical journeyings, but tax them. And put license laws, like you can't drive with the stuff, you can't...
Isn't the reason that
etc.
The war on drugs is there because when people take consciousness-raising drugs, they no longer want to participate in the game.
Yeah, well, that's... so it's a catch-22, isn't it?
The system is protecting itself, is guarding against the discontinuation of the game by stopping people from actually seeing through the game. By raising their consciousness. So it's quite intentional.
Yeah, well, I think there are two solutions to that problem. Firstly is you don't need the drugs to get enlightened, as Ram Dass and many others realise, It's you can get there naturally. And I advocate personally the natural enlightenment high, which, we have all the drugs we need in our own brain. If you practice meditation, if you practice philosophy in some way, if you cultivate your own states of consciousness, you can achieve exactly what you can get from any kind of fix, and it's safe, it's legal, it's free. So we have our own. It lasts longer. It doesn't have side effects. So I mean that's the solution to that one. All I'm saying is that for those that haven't got there yet, it's ridiculous to kind of persecute them. What we should be doing is giving like trainings and exercises and helping them to get their natural.
What I'm saying is the system doesn't want people to get conscious, because if they get conscious, they're not going to work in the factories and be,
I don't know.
John Harris puts it very well. He says there's nothing changed except from slave. We're still slaves. It's just that now they have the manacles on our minds rather than our ankles and our wrists, but we don't see it.
Well, yeah, no, very good point, and that's why the freeing of our minds is the first and most important thing. And that's where education comes in. That's where philosophy comes in. It's about liberation philosophy.
But what I'm saying is that society's war on drugs is not ignorant. It's actually quite intentional. It's a beast.
I don't agree.
It's a beast ensuring its own survival.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, and that's kind of like some people argue that, and it's a conspiracy thing. And I actually don't agree with that position. Let me say why. Right, I think it's an unconscious thing, and I think it goes back to this Sophia-phobia. The kind of people that are doing the war on drugs, upright Baptists who are Republican congressmen and, whose grandfather was a nice upright Baptist congressman and so on, back for generations, never touched a drug in their lives apart from probably alcohol. They genuinely and honest believe these things are evil. They've never been there, everyone they've met who has anything to do with them is, some kind of weirdo. So they genuinely believe they come from the devil. It's an occult battle as far as they're concerned. They're fighting the devil, literally. And they genuinely believe that, right? It's an ideological thing. The same with, that's the anti-drug lobby. They think that. I think what I'm advocating as a peace philosopher is a peace deal here, a peace treaty. I've kind of met people on both sides of the debate, and I'd like to announce to both of them that neither of them are totally, truly evil. I've met people who've been on the opposite side, who've been convinced, like missionary drug dealers like Howard Marks, who thought that the only way to save the planet is like get everybody to get high. You know, there were people around in the 60s that I met in the 70s who said, you know, the only way to get out of the system is to take acid and reach enlightenment, you know. And I admire what they were doing. They were visionaries. They were pioneers of psychedelic consciousness. What I think we need to do is have a peace treaty on this one. Make it optional, like everything else, you know. I mean, there might be a time in many people's lives when they want to kind of have that altered state experience. So there should be a place they can go with a license and have that high, you know, talking to people who know how to get them through it, to come out the other side, the quality's assured, they have that experience. In the old days, in the Greek mystical tradition of the mysteries, you went to Ephesus, you had your magic potion, you saw the underworld. I'm very interested as a philosopher in neurochemistry and how these things work. Gordon Wasson and other people have talked about the Greek mysteries. Apparently they used to give you a version of an ergo, which grows on rye, which produced the same effects as LSD, which produced the descent to the underworld, you know. So I think people have the right to that. That's our metaphysical birthright. But you don't want to do it every weekend. Once or twice in a lifetime is enough. It should be enough, right? And if it had the right cultural trappings, we're talking about the rebirth of the ancient mysteries here, which is why I support the kind of neo-pagan movement in its desire to bring back that ancient wisdom. What I think is wrong is for the non-users, the people who choose not to do that, to then have the kind of religious right to oppress those that want to. This becomes a political thing when you look at it in relation to the rights of indigenous peoples around the planet versus the rights of colonial peoples around the planet. Because often the indigenous peoples in the Amazon with ayahuasca, or shamans in Central Asia or whatever, are still clinging to their indigenous consciousness tools, you know. And I don't think that so-called civilized developed peoples have the right to deny access to that. So I think this is part of the truth conversation that's needed on the planet. And I think it is connected to the militarization of the planet, because the war on drugs often acts as a kind of an excuse for the militarization of different regions. If we could have a peace on drugs and a peace on consciousness, I think then we'd really be getting somewhere. I think we could stop investing so much money into actually like trying to kill off consciousness. We could actually ask, what is consciousness? Where does it come from? You know, what are the mechanisms in our brain that produce it? You know, the new science, quantum physics, looking at how the brain actually functions is fascinating. We could actually get a mature debate going on. And what I'm looking for is a kind of an enlightened world. That's the kind of final message I'd like to kind of give from Philosophers of Peace and from my institute, is how can we build the structures of an enlightened world in which militarism can be totally scaled down, fear can be totally scaled down, all forms of phobia, Sophia-phobia, etc. And we can emphasize wisdom, and you know, that's the idea of the periodic table of the religions. If we can get the communication going, we can then begin to start asking, what will a peaceful world look like? You know, which can affirm beauty, integrity, and the innate genius in every single human being on this planet. We're all divine children. That spark of God is inside all of us. Let's bring that out. Let's have education systems that make that possible. You know, and let the media do its part too. So thank you, Brian. You're doing a great job.
What was your website again?
It's just called thewisdompages.co.uk, and my institute website is educationaid.net. I've got my PhD ceremony at the University of London tomorrow because I wrote a doctoral thesis putting in a nutshell some of the ideas I've been talking about, which is a very interesting intellectual exercise. I do recommend people to use academia and stretch your minds, you know. These arguments have to be won at a high level, and don't drop out, you know, get in there, work within the education systems, within the scientific communities, you know, and have this battle of ideas. Too many academics are actually afraid of wisdom, which is a great shame. I think the way academia runs is it puts people into little pigeonholes and boxes, you know, you're a specialist in this and that. Anyway, so what I've done in my thesis is come up with this notion of transpersonal history. I've combined the concepts of transpersonal psychology, Jung, Wilber, Maslow, Groff, and all that lot, with the historical profession. You know, I started as a historian, and my special interest is the history of ideas. What I've argued as a historian is that you have to take on board the fact that people and their lives and their stories and their histories have a transpersonal dimension, but that it can be studied scientifically and its history can be told scientifically.